So I should begin with shalom, and then I should say I'm probably out of my league by having so many people listen to me. So anyway,
I think he just disconnected his link. I hope he wasn't serious and decided just to leave. There he is. This is funny.
Sudden case of stage fright.
Right.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, excellent. We just thought it was stage fright and you decide to leave.
I thought so.
leaving, but then I came back. Um,
Awesome. Thank you.
well, you're very welcome because obviously most of you already know most of everything. I'm talking with Mike tonight because Mike and I know Vendel. You know Vendel, right, Mike? And so I have two favorite topics. One is the incense that was found by two of my friends, Tony and Glenda Hurst. And the other topic is this one, the ashes of the red heifer, which I learned from Vendel. And so I have a spin on this that's probably a little bit different than what most people do. But Vendel, to me, it was one of the great contributors to our movement because he backed out of the Baptist church where he was quite successful. In fact, he lost his, I don't know if you even know this, but he lost his ministry because he in his Baptist church, he refused to have an altar call. And the people began to ask him, in fact, his deacons were questioning, he says, you've got all these people here and you've never made an altar call. And he says, no, I can't use what his language is. But anyway, he said that if you know Vendel, you can't very well put all of what he says on air. But he was a wonderful man, and he knows the Bible. You know, he started. It was back in 1954, and I don't know. Let me give you a history lesson. It's not in any of my notes, but let me give you a history lesson. 1954, cave number 3, there was found a scroll, different than any of the other scrolls. It was copper. And besides being copper, it was written so that the text was actually punctured out and not in. In other words, this person, whoever it was, wrote backwards and through the template. The scroll was rolled up. It was about 12 foot long, is my understanding. And this scroll itself contained a lot of information, basic information. But it wasn't until about 1960 that people were beginning to be made known that this scroll existed. Now, we knew about the Dead Sea Scrolls, but we didn't know about this one. And Vendel found out about it while he was out east somewhere, and he began to study the scroll. Now, the scroll is written in Hebrew, but we have to understand that Hebrew today is not the Hebrew that was spoken in the days of the second temple period. It's changed. And so he couldn't even read it. But he had a wife who was of Lebanese descent, who was a Jew, who could read Old Hebrew. And so between the two of them, the text had been translated on paper. And so they began to go through the Torah scroll itself, the copper scroll, and they began to read it. And so by 1967, just before the Six-Day War, Vendel moves his family to Israel. Now, he finds himself with no place to go, but he ends up in a kibbutz that was communist. And while he's in this communist kibbutz, he begins to look around because he's interested in finding the place where all the items that were listed on the scroll can be found. And so as he's looking around, he knows that he has several landmarks, that there were 7 rivers that flowed down into there, that the river that he was looking for was probably going to be a dry wadi bed at this point in time, and was going to be located near a mountain that had 70 stones on the face of it and had a cave of columns. And so he walked the Jordanian Valley back and forth until he came across all the landmarks that he understood to be there. Now, this was just about the time the war broke out. And so as he's walking around, shells are dropping as the war begins, and the Jordanians are now shooting at the Israelis. Now, in the midst of the shooting, Vendel is colorblind. And so he looked across the river, the Jordan River, and he could identify the gun emplacements. Having a walkie-talkie, he called back and started giving the gun emplacements to the Jewish army, who began to destroy them one by one all the way across. And by the time it was finished, Vendel was now a captain in the Israeli army. Quite a story. Well, anyway, he found the cave in 1968. And so he began the process of trying to get into it. But as I told you, he lived in a communist kibbutz, which was at the bottom of the same hill where the Cave of the Column was. And so he had a problem. They didn't want him to dig. So at night, he would trucks up there and he would begin to work in the cave. Finally, he got somebody from the Israeli Antiquities Authority to agree to allow him to look and to find things. Now, he found a bottle of oil, the same oil that was the anointing oil. Came in a small vial, and it was wrapped in palm leaves to preserve it. And he found a couple other small things. And so he knew he was on the right track because those were items that were on the checklist. Well, he couldn't go through the front entrance, so he began to go around the mountain, and he went to the back. And while he was on the back side, lo and behold, two of his friends, Glenda and Tony, ran across a pile of red dirt that was right there and mixed with all of the gray that was surrounding it. They found out after time that what they actually had was 2,000 pounds of incense that was used in the temple. Now, having found that, he now can go back to the institute or the antiquities and get a license to begin to dig. The only problem is the neighborhood still doesn't want it to happen. And now the Israelis are beginning to fear that what he's going to find is what he said he would find. Among the things that he thinks was there was the tabernacle itself that Moses had built, sitting upright in the cave in a third venue down. He also said he was going to find the ashes of the red heifer, which we understand is necessary, if you read Numbers 19, for the establishment of purity. And so that's where he was at. Well, they shut him down, and Rabbi Aden Steinsaltz, remember who he is, one of the greatest rabbis today who helped rewrite the Talmud into a more common language. He wrote a glorious letter hoping that he could get things to happen. But every time it looked like they were going to get started, something happened and they couldn't go any farther. So the story goes that he now finds himself dying. And there are other people who have picked up the mantle and are trying to get to this point. And again, they can't go through the front. So they found themselves a trap that goes down about 250 feet. And it's all steps. And it goes to nowhere. Well, finally, a year ago, they blew open that what appeared to be rock was only a plaster and were able to go further down, but they still hadn't got to anything. And so that's where they were at this spring. And I haven't been able to talk to Larry to ask what's gone on since then, but I don't think much of anything has happened because the Bureau of Antiquities talked them into going somewhere else. And so they may not have gotten to where they were intended to go. Now, this chapter, 19 through, is an amazing set of stories. But the one common thread that runs through all of them is death. First story is the ashes of the red heifer that deals with the purity from somebody who has touched a dead body. The second story that's in here is the death of Miriam. Now, the death of Miriam leads to the fact that they no longer had that well supply that Miriam was responsible for. And so God made Moses and Aaron simply go out and speak to a rock, which we know that they didn't speak to a rock, which caused their deaths because neither of them would be able to go into the land. Moses and Aaron were the last two survivors of that 40-year experience. They were the last two to pass on. And that would clear the way for everybody to go into the land. Well, besides those two, after the incident of the water, we read the death of Aaron on Mount Hor. Now, one of the things that happened while I was down in the Arava this last time, we went out looking for the place of Aaron's burial. Now, if you've got a map in your head, you know where the Dead Sea is. At the bottom of the Dead Sea, just a little bit below, about a quarter or half inch, a little bit to the left, you will find that is the place where Tel Tamar is located. And Tel Tamar was the spot where the Jews camped at one time, and probably close to the area where the rock that they missed was located. Moving on from there, people said that he went to the across the Jordan River. But the story doesn't lead us across the Jordan River. The story leads us to the east or to the west towards the Mediterranean. So there is a group of archaeologists who believe that they have found Aaron's tomb. And if so, Mount Hor is actually west of where they were camping. Because you see, just north of that was the king of Arad. And if you've read your Parsha this week, you know the king of Arad became an enemy, and there was a war between the Israelites and the Amalekites that cost the king his life, as well as many of his people. From there, we find them turning and going east, which is what it should have been, across the Jordan and up. And as they're moving up, they run into the king of Sion. And Sion is the first king that they run across. He's an Ammonite. And he ends up going against them, and they end up killing him and many of his people. They continue to go further north, where they begin to understand this is where Gad and half of the tribe of, what's Joseph's second son? Anyway, they're going north. And in the process, they kill the king of Og, or the king of Bashan, his name was Og, which leads me to a very interesting question. You see, Og is written in the Midrash as being the one who told Abraham about the loss of his son, his nephew, Lot. And he goes up with his men to fight Nimrod and the rest. Og is the one that there's a story that says that he's the one that was able to find a log that he would live on for the 1 year that the boat was out on the waters with Noah, and that he would be fed by one of the people on the boat through the window. And so he would be the Nephilim that actually crossed over along with the magic 8. So let's go back to the story. Everything now deals with the idea of death somewhere along the line. So we get a common theme that's going on throughout the story. Oh, I kind of missed the story of the plague of the copper snakes. That was the first one. But you remember the copper snake, every time they looked up, they survived. Midrashic writing says that didn't last. When they doubted, the snakes bit them again, forcing them to look up, forcing them to go higher. And now here we're going to deal with something that's going lower. We're dealing with the ashes. And so I want to get to the story, and I'm not going to follow my pattern. I want to actually read with you the story in Numbers 19. And I want to talk myself through a lot of this. Much of it's from the Midrash, some of it's from the Talmud, some of it's from what Bendel had written. And so it's kind of a hodgepodge of all the different kinds of things that are going on. But I want you to look at hukas. Now, the word hukas itself, many of you already understand, is the word for a decree or a statute. Now, a single statute is called a hoch, but this is going to be a series, but yet it only deals with one. So the question is, what's going on? Well, the story is out of time. It's out of place. And the reason I say that is because according to the Midrashic writings and according to everything else, this story was told to Moses just after crossing the Sea of Reeds and going into the land or into the wilderness. Now, if that's true, we're now 40 years after that fact. So why is it here and not where it belongs? That becomes a question. Another question as we're going through this whole idea. Moses finds out at the beginning. If you were Moses and you've heard this story, and we'll get into the whole ramifications of the story, why was he told so early? Probably because the calf, the heifer, was not born yet or had just been born. Because you see, there's a prescribed age for this animal. And so this age of this animal becomes very important. And so we know we're going to go 50 days to Mount Sinai. And I can imagine at points in time all the way along, Moses was looking for this heifer. But it wasn't until almost a year later, the second year, that we find the tabernacle being built. And it was not until after the tabernacle was functioning on the 2nd of Nisan that Moses watched over the killing of this heifer. So now we're talking about almost a 2-year time frame as we're moving forward. So what's going on? Why did they have to wait? Why didn't he do it earlier? What's the significance of putting it here and now at this particular point in time? So we'll get into those stories as we go along. But let's start with the very first verse, if you're ready, okay? So Hashem spoke to Moses and to Aaron. Notice his audience. His audience is always Moses first. Aaron was also there. So Aaron was also responsible for this whole process that's going on. Because Aaron is going to be the one who actually helps carry it out. So that's why Aaron is listening. But the whole story goes to Moses. Moses is going to filter this because he's going to have problems with the story. Things aren't exactly the way he thinks they should be. Now, the second verse says, this is the decree of the Torah. Now, the words are Zot, Haka, let me try it again. Zot, Hapara, Aduma. The concept is that this is about the purification. This cow must be perfect. By perfect, the understanding is, now you can go get a book by Hillel, part of his sections dealing with the Mishnah Torah, in which he will spend 20 chapters explaining this chapter. All the nuances that go into this whole story. For the simpleness of us, all we have to understand that this calf that there's going to sacrifice between the ages of 1 and 2 will have never been ridden, will have never seen any work, and will have never been involved with calving another animal. And it must not have more than one hair other than the red hair that it's called by. And we have to understand, for Tar and those who obviously deal with Texas cows, red doesn't mean red like a fire engine. Red means red-brown, right? That's the color of the calf. Has to be a reddish brown color, but no black hair, no white hair, no hair of any other color but one. So it's going to take them a while to inspect this animal. And so it would have been over a period of time that they had been watching this and waiting for the right time for this whole thing to happen. So the decree is from the Torah, which Hashem had commanded, saying, speak to the children of Israel, and they shall take to you a completely red cow. A completely red cow. Now, when we think of red, we think of sin. And that probably is partially right, because we are dealing with sin. We're dealing with the sin that brings about death. But it's more than just that. This particular cow had to be a female. It's not a male, it's a female. And so the question is, why did it have to be a female? Why did it have to be so pure? What are we missing from the story? Well, we can borrow from a story that's just another chapter over, and that's the Nahash, the serpents. You see, our story really focuses on the very first sin, the sin that brought death into this world. Because remember, Adam and Eve had no sin. Sin was not a part or a question that was asked in this whole story. What's been asked is, at this point in time, the purification of somebody who touches a dead corpse. That's what's going to happen. Or is in the room with the same with this corpse. Or is under a tree with this corpse. In other words, you don't even have to be physically touching them. Your location is just as important. Just as Adam and Eve's location in the garden was important. Nothing could begin with this whole story until the tabernacle was done. Well, why the tabernacle did it have to be done? Why was the temple so important? Do you remember the inside of the temple? Do you remember what the walls of the temple look like? The palm trees, the animals. The inside of the tabernacle and the tent was to remind them of Eden. God visited Adam and Eve in Eden. Then he removed himself. And so now God is asking them to build him a place to live. He has a few qualifications, what he wants this place to look like. And so as they're building it, Bezalel puts into it the colors of trees, the colors of animals. All of those things are now found within this, because this is actually going all the way back to Eden. That's where this story is actually coming from. And so it comes from the impurity of death. Now, when Israel was marching through the wilderness and got to Mount Sinai, I think it's in Soda, they begin to talk about the fact that they had reached the level now, the 49th level, where they were not going to die, because they had already agreed to its terms. Whatever you say, whatever we hear, that's what we'll do. And so death was taken off the table. At that point in time, had they waited long enough for the tablets to come down and be presented to them, if they would have waited just a day longer, we wouldn't be here as we are now. We would have been in what we would call the world to come, the age of the Messiah. But they didn't wait, remember? And what did they do? They built themselves a calf. This calf then was gold in color. It's interesting, and I don't know if you ever read the Quran. There's only a couple places that are interesting to me in the Quran, and that's because the Quran is basically attempting in the early writings, the history of this whole thing, of rewriting Ishmael in and Esau in and Jacob and Isaac out. Abraham is good because he's the founder. But in the process of going through this, Instead of a red cow, what they're searching for is a gold cow, a yellow cow. And if they ever find this yellow cow, then they will control the world, because that will be the sign of the end. What is it that we're looking for? The Messiah to come. What will the Messiah need to bring or have in order to take us out of the world of sin? How will he create purity in us? Because impure people can't live with God. God separates himself. Now he's internal, so that makes it rather a paradox that's going on. But there's lots of paradoxes in our stories, lots of changes that we're going to have to go through. And so as we're looking at this whole story, then we're looking for a cow that's going to be offered. But time out. It's not offered on the altar. It can't be. You see, it can't be offered within the tabernacle confines or within the temple confines. Moses will will be a part of the sacrifice of the first one. It will be done outside the camp, east of the camp. They will be able to see what would be the Holy of Holies, or that area where the Holy of Holies is. That's the parameter of the story. So it would be sacrificed out there. Now let me give you Vendel's understanding of what's going on. In order for this cow to be perfectly sacrificed, besides the kosher cutting and all of that goes with it, the animal itself will be burnt on a pyre. At the end of this burning, the ashes will be scooped up. The dung of the cow will be used to build what's called a kalel, a vessel, a bowl, in which the ashes could be kept. Now the ashes and all of the material that's there is going to be crushed even finer, to the point of not being able to recognize any part of it. And it will be put inside this kalel. And the kalel will be kept by Moses, or by Aaron, who will become the high priest. And it will be distributed around the camp, because everybody, in order to come to the tabernacle, who has involved himself with death of any sort, will have to be purified. And so the ashes will be spread in other small containers. They'll be given to the clan, to the clan leaders. The clan leaders themselves then will give it away as the person chooses to go to the tabernacle. The same thing happens as you go to the temple. At the temple site, the animal was sacrificed on the Mount of Olives. Again, eyesight to the area where the Ark of the Covenant would have been sitting. Now the second, the first one was Moses. And Moses will be given credit for all of them, because you see the ashes of that first heifer will be mixed with the ashes of the second heifer. And each and every heifer that's been added after that will again receive what's left of the previous ashes. So the ashes that are going to be found in the days of the Messiah's coming, because the 10th one has been identified that, according to the rabbis, that is the one that the Messiah will have. Now, let me give you some controversy. The Jewish people back in, 2019, were expecting the fact that the Messiah would come. Well, if he didn't, and all things lined up correctly, and the Jews could go up on the Temple Mount, they were planning to offer the offerings necessary for Yom Kippur. Well, wait a second. I thought you needed to be clean before you could do that. Well, then the question has to be, do you need the original ashes before? Rabbi Richmond, who is a part of the Temple Institute, is a part of this whole process, says, no, you didn't need to. fact, they have a Kohen Gadol. There is a high priest that's been put into this position as they go through. His name is Rabbi Kahane. Rabbi Kahane, Baruch Kahane, is a well-studied scholar. He studied at the Institute of Avraham Kook, who was the original chief rabbi of Israel back in the early 1900s. And they studied in the school, and he knows all the laws, and he knows how things have to be done. And so they said, yeah, we can go ahead and do it. We'll be a little off, but we have to follow the plan. And they believed the plan was, we will start temple worship, then we will gather all that we need. Now, they've been looking for years for a red heifer. They keep saying, no, we don't have one. We think we've got one here. And oh, by the way, the heifer doesn't have to belong to a Jew. One of the heifers actually belonged to a Gentile. And the interesting story, and it's another story I want to give you. The interesting story is that this man had, well, he was a jeweler. He had precious stones that he had been collecting and working with. And anyway, his father was actually the one in charge. And so he just simply, well, they came to him because they needed one of the stones to put into the breastplate of the high priest, because one of them had become fractured and lost. And so they needed to replace it. So they came to him knowing that he had it. And he says, yeah, I have that. He says, but I can't give it to you now. And they said, why not? Oh, my dad's taking a nap and I can't give you the stone. What do you mean you can't? Wake him up. They were willing to give him a great deal of money for that stone. But he said, no, honor my father. I can't wake him up. And so they went and they found another jeweler and they found another stone and they began to use it. Well, according to the Midrashic writing, that this man, David, he also had cattle. And wouldn't you know, they were running low on ashes. And he had one of those rare animals that had only one black hair. And so they came back to him and they says, we want to buy your heifer. He says, well, that's fine. And he says, well, this is how much we'll give you. And he said, no. I only want what you would have given me for the jewel. So he turned down thousands in order to take less. But he had honored his father, and maybe that's why God gave him the opportunity this way. Well, anyway, the story is going sideways, but the bottom line of our story is the fact that some say you need the ashes in order to start the process. The rabbis, some of them are saying, no, you don't. We'll just start and then we'll collect what we need. Rabbi Richmond said that they could sacrifice the animals on Mount Carmel because Mount Carmel had been identified by Elijah as a place that was capable of holding sacrifices. Some said, well, we can go to Shiloh because Shiloh is where the last of the tabernacle was. So we could go sacrifice there. We know exactly where the altar is because if you've ever been there, you actually see the stones and where everything actually was. So they began arguing amongst themselves. Well, 2019 passed, Yom Kippur passed, they didn't get it done. But they continued to practice sacrifices out in the wilderness, preparing for that day when they can. So let's go back to the story. So the understanding is that there's this yoke or this unyoked animal that they have to have in order to begin this. So it goes in verse number, where did we leave off? Verse number 5, right? You shall give it to Eleazar the Cohen, and he shall take it out to the outside of the camp, east of the camp actually, and someone shall slaughter it in its presence, in his presence. Who's Eleazar? Eleazar would have been what we would have called the associate high priest. He's the son of Aaron. He was next in line to inherit the position of the Cohen. And so he was the one who would go back and actually supervise, because you see, it required a shochet, a religious slaughterer, in order to cut the throat of the animal and to begin to bleed the animal out. Now, while the animal is cut and has passed away, the rabbi, the Cohen, will go and take the water, or take the blood from the throat, and he will begin to sprinkle it towards the tabernacle or towards the temple as part of the process, a transference of purity towards that whole building. So as he's doing this, he goes continues on, it says, the Cohen shall take cedar wood, hyssop, and crimson thread, and he shall throw them into the burning of the cow. Cow is now slaughtered, still in whole, not in parts like you would for a regular sacrifice. This is an offering. And so the offering itself is laying on this fire. These ingredients are added at that particular point in time. So again, the dung from the animal provides the kalal, the vessel that it's going to be put in. And the animal's ashes will then be put in there along with the burnt hyssop and all of the cedar wood and all of those other things that will be necessary as you go through it. So he begins the process, and the Cohen shall immerse his clothing and immerse himself in water afterwards, and he may enter the camp, and the Cohen shall remain contaminated until evening, which begins the next set of paradoxes. If you're doing a sacrifice for purity, how do you become impure? His impurity came because of the death that he was now in contact with. This story transfers to each and every event in which someone or something dies. All of us have souls, but so does an animal. So if an animal dies, man is also contaminated by the animal. But his contamination only lasts one day, and he doesn't have to go through the ashes of the red heifer. He just simply has to go through the cleansing process, washing himself, immersing himself, his clothing, all of it has to be taken care of. And he moves on from there. Well, at the same point in time then, he became impure. Well, let's take the story one step farther. Let's say that somebody in the camp died, like Miriam, which is the very next story. Miriam dies, according to chapter 20, first couple of verses. So the first test case that we see then is the death of Miriam. Who is impure? Aaron couldn't be in that place because Aaron was the high priest. He could not be where death was, even if it's his own sister. So he was out. Moses would have been there, maybe, or he would have been out, or the other son might have been there. All of those possibilities. But whoever was there, and they took her out and they buried her. All who were in contact with her body are now impure. How do you take and correct that? Well, according to the rabbis and according to the Rambam, it's a 7-day process. We know about the Jews, when they lose a family member, they go through a shiva. They go through the 7-day of mourning period. Well, on the 3rd day of this man's life, who was carrying the body of Miriam, he would have gone to the tabernacle and he would have been sprinkled with the ashes of the red heifer. Not only would he have been sprinkled with it, that meant there was water involved. Well, what's the water for? All you need is the ashes. No, the water is about the Torah. You see, Torah is about water. It's about life. It's about refreshing. We also understand in Jewish concepts, and Christianity just drove me absolutely crazy because I kept trying to figure out how life after death, why wasn't it in the Old Testament like I thought it should be? Where was it? Well, it was wrapped into stories like this. It's wrapped in the stories like Sarah. In Jewish understanding, a person who is pure, even though they are dead, they are alive. And a person who is impure, even though he's alive, he is dead. Answer that one. That's the part of the paradox that's going on here. Adam and Eve were never supposed to die. How did God take care of them? He sacrificed an animal, made skins for them. Can you tell me what kind of animal he used? Could it have been a heifer? You see, a heifer is associated with females. Adumah is feminine. So our animal is feminine, dealing with this impurity. Enough stories within a story as we go through this, isn't there? So as we begin to move further into the story, the person who had been carrying the body or touching the body is now sprinkled on the third day and returns to his home, and he begins to study again. 4 days later, he will return, and at that point in time, he will have been sprinkled, and at the end of the day, he will be pure again. That's what would have happened. Now think about it this way. What about the guy who sprinkles you? Certainly he must be pure. Well, he was before he sprinkled you. Now he is impure. His impurity will last all the way till the evening, when he will become pure again, or able to be pure again. The process is continuing, one to another, to another, to another, over and over again as we go through this story. The man has to be cleansed, his clothing has to be cleansed, everything has to be made right in order for the story to go on. I want you to skip down, because I'm talking too long, to verse 11. Whoever touches the corpse of any human being shall be contaminated for 7 days. And he shall purify himself with it on the third day and on the seventh day, and then he shall become pure. But if he will not purify himself on the third day and on the seventh day, he remains impure. Man has a choice as to whether he really wants God, because you see, God deals in purity. His choice, what he's going to do. So as we go through this story over and over again, and you can read the rest of the story yourself, understand there are a lot of paradoxes. Solomon in Ecclesiastes, the 7th chapter, said, I don't know how, I don't understand it. Well, he knew the process, but he didn't understand the significance. And nobody truly understands all the points. We think we have ideas, we think we have understandings, but not necessarily so. So as we're going through this story, as we're going through all of the stories here, we're dealing with the paradox of death. What causes a person to become impure? You and I today live without a temple. Can you tell me what kind of condition we find ourselves in? An impure state. But yet, even in our impurity, God still loves us. What can we do? Well, the Jewish people have a simple answer. You read the chapter. You do what you can do to remind yourself of your responsibilities and the obligations that go. And so that's what's actually happening as we go through this whole story. I want to give you time, 15 minutes, that's not much time, to talk to me, to think out loud, because that's the best way for all of us to learn. You know, I used to think I had to talk 60 minutes, and then after the 60 minutes, you people had all the wisdom you'd ever need. And that ain't so, because I know I don't have all the wisdom. So think for a second, and I'll just shut up.